Welcome to Godless Bitches 2.0. This is Season 4, Episode 16. Today is December 1st, 2018, World AIDS Day. I'm here with Tracy Harris.
Hey.
I'm your host, Jen Peoples. We have a very special episode queued up for you today. Before we get started on that, Godless Bitches is a production of the Atheist Community of Austin, a nonprofit educational organization dedicated to the separation of church and state and the promotion of positive atheist culture. And our special guest for today's episode is Ingrid Nelson. Ingrid is a nurse practitioner, HIV specialist, and an activist, AIDS activist with ACT UP San Francisco. And Ingrid is on the phone with us today, dialing in from the West Coast. Ingrid, how are you?
I'm doing okay, thank you.
Great. Did I get any of that wrong?
No, that sounded perfect. I will say that ACT UP San Francisco, the AIDS activist group I was in, is no longer active, but a lot of us are still activists in a lot of different ways. So I still think of it as a part of who I am, even though it's technically in the past.
Of course. So we have a ton of questions for you, and I really appreciate you taking some time to join us today and share your expertise with us. I understand you currently work as a nurse practitioner with HIV-positive patients. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. I have two jobs. One is at an HIV clinic in Oakland, California, and I provide primary HIV care to patients there. And the other job is at a state prison where I provide the HIV care to the HIV-positive patients there. And sometimes also I do telemedicine, which is basically like providing medical care via something like Skype, video conferencing, because California, like Texas, is a very big state with a lot of prisons in remote areas, and they don't always have HIV specialists living near where they are. So it's a way to get care to all the positive people in different prisons throughout the state.
Okay.
And I believe Texas does a lot of that, too.
Well, yeah, I'm sure not as well as California, probably. We don't have a great track record when it comes to providing health care to marginalized communities.
No, we're really good at cutting funding and care.
Yeah.
Yeah, California probably is better than average with that, but
yeah,
we still have our issues.
Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds like, at least from a healthcare perspective, things have changed significantly in terms of HIV treatment and care over the years. Have you always worked with HIV patients, or did you get involved a little bit later?
Since I became a nurse practitioner, I've always worked in HIV. I went to nursing school in the mid-1990s. I actually started nursing school right about the time that effective HIV treatments were coming out.
Okay.
And I went to school in New York City, where the epidemic is a little different than it is in California. But it was, I was still able to learn. And so I remember being in the hospital in New York City in 1996 and giving patients protease inhibitors and other meds that we found, when used in combination, could actually control the virus to the point that people, even who were very sick and even dying, could get better and literally get up out of their hospital beds and go back to work and go back to living. And so that was kind of an amazing time to be learning. So that was just about, I finished my nurse practitioner training almost exactly 20 years ago. It'll be 20 years ago this coming March.
Wow.
So, yeah, and pretty much I went to school because I wanted to learn how to provide HIV care.
Oh, so was that decision basically informed by your prior activism?
It was a number of things. That was a big part of it. I also had been working before I went to nursing school. I was a medical assistant and health educator at Planned Parenthood.
Okay.
And I was mostly working in the abortion clinic there, providing assistance and emotional support during the procedures to help women get through it. And so being at Planned Parenthood, I worked with a lot of amazing nurse practitioners, and they were some of the people that inspired me to think about becoming a nurse practitioner myself. Also, in the AIDS activist world, there were a lot of nurses who had been caring for patients in the very, very early days. There's actually a documentary that just came out, which I'm not going to remember the name of, about Ward 5A at San Francisco General Hospital, which is one of the first dedicated wards for people with HIV. And some of the nurses that worked in that ward in the very early days were also AIDS activists and would come and speak and talk about caring for their patients. And those people also really inspired me. So it was a combination of AIDS activism and working at Planned Parenthood that made me decide to become a nurse practitioner.
Oh, very cool.
I actually think I just Googled, and it looks like the documentary. I was trying to see if this is interesting. The New York Times has done like a review. I don't know. I was trying to find the name of the documentary for you, but I think I might not have found it. They have a Ward 5B, a model of care for AIDS.
That's it. I'm sorry. I said 5A. It's
well, there was another entry for 5A, so I was like, well, I don't know if I have the right one here or not. But yeah, so it looks like maybe there's a review of it or some commentary at New York Times. But yeah, that title that they've got is Ward 5B, a model of care for AIDS.
Yes, that's the one I'm thinking of.
Well, that had to be a really exciting time to be entering the medical profession as a nurse practitioner, just to see, a drug cocktail that would completely change the lives of people who took it.
Yeah, it was amazing. And of course, it's changed a lot since then. I mean, I'm saying protease inhibitors because those were the most powerful drugs we had at the time. We mostly don't use protease inhibitors anymore. That's how much things have changed even since then. We mostly use a class of drugs called integrase inhibitors, still in combination with other meds. But, as I've been doing this work, it's gotten so much, I don't want to say easier, but it's a lot less stressful starting the meds for people because they're so much easier to take and so much better tolerated than they used to be. People generally become undetectable very quickly. It's rare that I have to change people's meds because of side effects. That used to be a big part of what I did was dealing with the side effects and trying to find what was going to be the best combination of things for people to take. And now it's usually one pill once a day, and usually people come back and say, side effects? I don't think I have any side effects.
So are these, I just wanted to ask, are these antivirals? Or
yeah, antiretrovirals.
Okay.
And, like I said, it's usually 3 medications combined into a single pill, at least for people who don't have any drug resistance. That's generally what we start people on. Well, I've also a lot of people that have been on sort of older, outdated regimens and have kind of been sort of low-key suffering with some side effects for a long time, and with, complicated schedules of pills to take, we're sometimes able to optimize or simplify their regimens and get them either onto a single pill or onto, a couple of pills once a day that are easier for them to take. So even people who need to be on something more complicated, we can usually do better because there are so many more options available than there used to be.
I think for a lot of people, what happened was that there was like this explosion of HIV and AIDS, and then there was these really toxic drugs that seemed to help people stay alive, but they had really bad side effects. And then it kind of fell off the map, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it didn't fall off the map for you because you're involved in it, but I think from a public standpoint, a lot of people are just like, whatever happened to HIV? Whatever happened to AIDS? Why don't we hear about this anymore? And I just wanted to kind of ask you, I have some thoughts about it, but the antivirals, now the goal of those is to get the viral load down to, you're saying undetectable. I think I heard someone on NPR the other day saying 0. What does this do? Because I think there are a lot of misconceptions. What does this do to a person's capacity to transmit the disease, for example, to a partner?
Yeah, good question.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's an excellent question, and I have a lot of feelings about how this gets talked about in the media because I think it's not always explained very well, and it sometimes creates misconceptions that I then have to spend time with my patients trying to correct. So the goal of treatment with medications is to get the viral load to what we call undetectable. We sometimes use the word suppressed. It is not a cure. It does not completely eradicate the virus from a person's system. Undetectable means undetectable in blood. And undetectable really just means below the limits of detection of the test. And in the years that I've been doing HIV care, we have used viral loads, which is a blood test to monitor the levels of the virus in the blood, and that's how you know if the meds are working or not. And if the person's taking them every day, which is a whole other struggle that we sometimes have. But if somebody takes their meds every day and their viral load becomes undetectable, the tests have gotten more and more sensitive over the years. It used to be 400 copies. That literally means viral particles in a milliliter of blood. So the way a viral load is written is copies per ml. And it used to be below 400 was undetectable, and then for a long time it was 75, and then it was 50 or 48, and now it's usually less than 20 is what we're trying to do. Because the tests have gotten so much more sensitive, we do sometimes see these little, what we call blips in the viral load, where it'll go up to 30 or 40 copies, and then we recheck it and it goes back to undetectable. As long as somebody can get back to undetectable, we know the meds are still working. It's when we see the viral load continually going up into the hundreds and then the thousands that we figure either the virus has become resistant to the medications we're using, or the person's not taking the medication every day, or sometimes there are drug interactions or other health conditions that interfere with the body's ability to absorb the medications. And if that's the case, we sometimes have to change what we're doing to get the person to undetectable. But generally, people who take the meds every day will become undetectable, and it's very, very rare these days that we're not able to find a regimen that will work for somebody if they can take it.
Okay. And so what would be the impact on partners?
Yes, so that was the big news story about 2 years ago, something we've kind of known in clinical practice for some time. But there are some very, very big studies that came out, partner studies, where they look at the old phrase was serodiscordant couples. We now like to say serodifferent, because that just sounds less negative.
Right.
We try to think a lot about the language that we use in the HIV care world, because there's so much shame and stigma that we really try to listen to how we sound and are we sounding negative when we're communicating with our patients about these things. So we think serodifferent sounds more neutral than serodiscordant, and we prefer to talk about patients being adherent with their meds as opposed to compliant, because that sounds judgmental. We think a lot about these things.
It does sound kind of criminal, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's the sort of thing that, you think about when you're having these conversations with people. So with these big studies, which were, 15,000 couples in one case, they were very big studies over many, many years, where one person was positive, the other was negative. And they weren't always using condoms, and the person who was positive was on meds and was undetectable. And what they found is that under those conditions, if all of those conditions that I just said were met, there were no transmissions.
Yeah, I wanted, and what's funny is, not funny, but interestingly, I knew this answer, but I wanted to hear you explain it. Because I think a lot of people still have the idea that, oh my gosh, if my partner has HIV, that's, no more sex, or, condoms forever.
That's often the first thing I have to say to patients is that, you don't need to think that your sex life is over. You're not going to be able to. And also having children is a big question that people have when they first test positive. And that's another thing that you can absolutely do. If your viral load is undetectable, you will not transmit to the baby. And people are very surprised to hear it. these things.
I have a friend. I was going to say I have a friend who has a partner who's HIV positive. They've been together for a long time, and they just had a child, and everything is. It's never been transmitted. It's everything is fine. It's
exactly.
And I think so many people just have not kept up, especially when it has gotten under such control, such great control. Yeah. Like you said, this is basically mild drugs from the standpoint of any kind of negative, impact on the person who's taking them.
Right.
And then it has this fantastic side effect of apparently, killing transmission in most cases.
Yeah.
And so
that's true. If we could have everybody on meds, we would not. We could stop this disease. We really could. But I want to speak about the difference between undetectable and zero.
Okay.
So getting to zero is a slogan. And that's like a public health measure where we're trying to get to zero new transmission.
Right.
And that's not the same thing as your viral load being zero.
Okay.
So an undetectable viral load is not a zero viral load.
Got it.
And this is one of the places where people get confused, I think, is that when we're talking about getting to zero, we're not talking about a viral load of zero. We're talking about zero transmission, zero new infections.
So another cool thing that I wanted to mention is that the research into this and what ultimately resulted in the treatments that we're using today have also helped other people who suffer from illnesses that are viral, right? So you have situations, for example, with viral, like herpes. And you have a similar situation where people with herpes now can take antivirals, and they have a similar situation where this then makes this safe for your partner, so that you're not transmitting to a partner.
That's a somewhat different situation because what you're doing with anti-herpes medications is you're just suppressing outbreaks, which is usually how the virus gets transmitted. Yeah. We don't measure viral loads, for example, with herpes. We do with hepatitis, but not with herpes. But yes, it is true that if you take suppressive drugs for herpes, you're much less likely. No one's ever done a study of this scale to say whether there's been zero transmissions. I kind of doubt that that's possible with herpes, but you could certainly cut them way, way down.
Yeah, and I mean,
and of course
the transmission rates in herpes are not that high to begin with, right? So that's what's interesting. It's like
usually it's when people have an outbreak, but there can be what's called viral shedding at other times.
Right.
So I don't know that the drugs 100% prevent that.
So I do have a question.
Again, I don't think it's been studied to that degree because it's not a life-threatening illness.
So I have a question though about. So here's the thing: there was a study that was done that was more of an ethical study where they offered people, I guess they were offering them money, and they said they couldn't have the money if I forget how it worked, but they were going to give them information. They had to take a blood test, and they said for this study, there was all these different parameters, but they said, one thing we can do is we can give you like an STI testing. We're testing for all these things, for herpes, for HIV, for whatever, and it somehow it was going to cost them, like they would get paid less if they refused the STI testing, and people refused it. Right, so they didn't want to be tested, even though it was going to be anonymous testing. They were assured that this was going to be anonymous. No one's going to know. This isn't going to pass to anybody. It's just going to go to you, and it's going to cost you money if you don't do it. Like, we're going to pay you, but you get paid less if you don't do this screening. And the people were willing to lose the money to not be screened, to not find out. And I think what's happening is really kind of ill because we have a situation where things are so much better now for people that have these illnesses, and yet the stigma is so huge that people are unwilling to even want to know. That's like, I don't want to know if I have it. And so then you run into this huge problem where you get these large percentages of people who don't know they have these things, and they don't want to go tested because they just don't want to find out. And so what are we looking at with regard to estimates of percentage of people that are carrying HIV that probably don't know?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I will say I'm not familiar with the study that you're talking about, so I don't want to say anything too specific about that. But it is true that financial incentives are one of the things that have been looked at as ways to motivate people, because that is something that we really struggle with, is motivation to get tested and find out you're positive, motivation to come into the clinic and see a medical provider once you find out you're positive, motivation to get that prescription for the pills and fill it and go to the pharmacy, and then motivation to take those pills every day, year after year after year. I mean, one of the things I want to say is that I don't want to minimize the fact that this is still a lifelong chronic illness that people have to live with, and that is difficult. And that's something that people really struggle with, which is why we talk about adherence so much when we're talking about HIV care, and that at every stage in that process that I just talked about, there's a drop-off. Like there's a number of people who have been tested, and then there's the percentage of those people who tested positive. And then there's the percentage of people who know they're positive who actually go to a medical clinic for care. And then there's the percentage of those people who stay in care and keep their appointments and keep coming in. And then there's the percentage of those people who take the meds. And then there's the percentage of the people who take the meds who are able to stay on them consistently for year after year and get undetectable and stay undetectable. And if you look at those graphs, it's like it slopes downward.
Right.
Yeah.
And everywhere, even in places like New York City and San Francisco, and, you know, where there's the best care available and where there's a very high level of awareness and probably less stigma than in other places, there's still a drop-off. And we call it the cascade of care. And every time you go to an HIV conference, you see that slide with the bar graph sloping downward. And we always are talking about how can we, at each step in that process, how can we boost the numbers? And how can we get more people undetectable and more people knowing they're positive every step of the way? So some of it is just that, you know, a lot of what I do, especially in the prison, most of the people I see at the clinic have been positive, you know, and they know they're positive, but a lot of people who are incarcerated, there's routine opt-out testing when they come into the prison system. And so they get tested for HIV and for hepatitis C unless they decline it.
I think for the average person, though, what's happening is that a lot of what keeps them from going and getting tested and finding out, just get a regular screening. I mean, for me, anybody that's like sexually active, it would be a good idea to just every now and then, even if you're in a monogamous relationship, just every couple of years, maybe request a screening for an STI screening. I think
STI screening.
I think it's a good idea, but I think part of the problem that I have seen just in people that I've talked to that I know have STIs that are like this or that are this, it's the issue becomes that you then for the rest of your life have to announce to every partner that you have this illness. And there are people who are going to reject you flatly for that. And it's weird. The thing that makes me angry is that while you're always going to have a certain percentage of prejudice of people who are just going to say, you know, no, this is an absolute, you know, would not ever do this. The more people know, the more it starts to become less frightening, right? So even if you're not infected, when you start to learn about the statistics of, oh, wait, this is the state of it now, because this isn't as bad as what I remember, or this isn't as bad as what I thought. And so a huge part of the stigma, which is just like a person with that tells me they have this, I would just never consider for a partnership. I think they're facing that in a greater wave than would be the case if people would calm down and really look at the information. And I think that fear of saying, I will always have to tell people this if I want to be intimate with them, which is the most vulnerable, right? This is when people, you like somebody, you've clicked with them, maybe you've gone out with them, and now you're sitting here and you're thinking, when do I say this? Because I have to say this. And now that I know that I have this, I have to admit this to somebody who at this point I want to be intimate and I really like them, and I could get kicked to the curb just for this one thing that if I would just have an opportunity to explain to them, it's not that bad. But you might not ever get that opportunity.
Actually, it reminds me, there was an article several years ago, I think it was in The Advocate magazine, and it was written by a gay man, and his article basically was saying that you should go into every sexual encounter assuming that you're both HIV positive. And if you do that, then first of all, it starts to remove a lot of the stigma. And the second, you'll always act in a way that will protect yourself from infection.
And this is the other thing. When you find out, you have access to all these treatments that can be so helpful, right? And I know it's not HIV, but it's like I just have a close friend who is was diagnosed with herpes, right? And I did a lot of research because I was just like, well, let me find out what this means, right? So I looked into it, and when the more I learned, the more I was like, this is not that bad.
Yeah.
And to this day, they have had partners who are screened they've never passed it on to somebody else, right? And they know from the medical treatment that they're getting that they are very unlikely to pass this on to anyone else, that they are being treated, that they are being careful. And yet, I sit there trying to tell them, don't you understand? Like, you're not getting any outbreaks. You have not transmitted this in the 3 years that you've been diagnosed. You know, you're okay. You're not hurting anybody. Your partners are aware. You're doing all the responsible things, and everybody is being safe here. And in the meantime, though, they still hammer themselves about it, and they can't get over it. And they're just like, they can't see it like that, right? All they see is, I have this thing that other people judge me for. And I just look at that, and it's like, I wish they could get past it. Because I'm like, this shouldn't bother anybody once they understand it, but they're still kind of living in that stigma, and it hurts me to see them hurt that way.
Yeah,
that's true, and of course the thing about herpes is that, again, it's not life-threatening. It doesn't really cause any serious complications. I mean, I've seen some pretty severe outbreaks. It can be
but they're
painful,
rare.
But they heal in a few days, and mostly when people take the meds, they might get 1 or 2 outbreaks a year. It really, I don't mean to, again, dismiss that, but in terms of like health conditions you could have, it is very far down the list of the worst things.
Yeah, right. And I understand it doesn't interact with other potential, health conditions.
But I mean, you could sit there and tell them this, but it's like they're still feeling ashamed, and they still are ashamed to talk to other people and afraid to talk to other partners. And I'm just like, this isn't as bad as you're making it in your head.
Right.
But it is to some people.
It's a disease they got from sex, right? Like, that's the reason.
It is. If this,
if it was a disease you got from riding the subway, nobody would think that you were a bad person for having it.
Yeah.
Well,
but because it was transmitted the way it was, that's why there's stigma.
Yeah. The more I learned about these things, when I did have, opportunity and reason to go in and look into this, one of the things I just realized was this is so mild compared to so many things, and there are much worse things that are not sexually transmitted that nobody judges you for. And so, it is absolutely the sexual connection that does this. But I just think that anything we can do to help people understand the current state of this, and that the stigmas that are attached to this, and the horror stories. I think part of it is when you Google something like this, the first thing you see are like the very worst of the worst things that could pop, the photos, and it's just awful. And you're like,
I was going to say, don't do a Google image search.
Then you find out that this is like some tiny percentage of some tiny percentage of some percentage of people. Yeah. And you're like, whoa. It's like you said, it scales down, right? And by the time you're looking at the photo that represents what's in everybody's head, it's like it is the example that almost no one has with this illness.
Right. Well, and I think that a lot of people still are operating under, an image of HIV and AIDS that is decades out of date. But I think it's probably worthwhile to go back and talk a little bit about the early days of the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I will say is that I do still see people suffer and die of untreated HIV and AIDS. I mean, that absolutely still happens. And it's important to talk about who those people are and why that happens, because that's about different kinds of marginalization. That's about race, and it's about poverty, and it's about being queer or being trans. It's about being sex workers. It's about being homeless, immigrants. Those are the people that have a harder time getting access to care. And when you look at that cascade of care, and when you look at who drops off, those are the people that are more likely to not stay in care and not be able to take the meds and stay undetectable. And that's something that we, as HIV providers, really struggle with. And we've sometimes, watched our patients suffer and die because they're just not able to take those pills every day.
Yeah. Yeah, I know early on, I understand the pills had a lot of pretty horrific side effects for some people. And
yes, they did. And you had to take them 3 times a day, handfuls of pills. This one you have to take with water. This one you have to take with food.
Yeah.
Another thing that comes up a lot with HIV medicines is drug interactions. Because of the way they're metabolized through the liver, there are certain pathways that they go through that can interfere with other medications, and that can cause either reduced blood levels so the meds don't work, or it can cause increased blood levels so that there's more likely to be toxicity. So, there's a lot of still things that we have to think about when we're prescribing these meds. And again, it's gotten easier over the years, but those are still things that I have to be thoughtful about when I'm deciding what meds to put people on and when I'm monitoring them.
Yeah. Well, speaking of historically what things looked like, I remember I was in college when we first became aware that something was happening with gay men, and we didn't know what it was. And I had friends of mine, a lesbian couple, and they were both out to their parents. And one of them, her mother approached her and said, "Are you guys going to get sick now?" Because there was so much that wasn't known about this epidemic, and we didn't really even understand a lot about how the virus is transmitted. And so the assumption was that if you were gay, you were this disease and die, and it didn't matter if you were male or female. And at the time, there was really not a recognition that it had moved, into the blood supply and that other people were at risk.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I have some memories of those early days, too. I mean, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I do remember reading stories in the paper about the ward at San Francisco General and about there was a vigil at the Federal Building in San Francisco for years where there was a group of people who chained themselves to the doors and to protest. It was one of the very first AIDS activist things that ever happened. I want to say 85. It was very early.
Yeah.
And they stayed for several years. They just had like a little tent encampment outside the Federal Building for years. And I remember reading about that when I was either late high school or early college. And also I read Randy Shilts and the band Played On very early, kind of the same year that I was coming out as queer was when that book came out.
Yeah.
And the thing about being a queer woman in the early days of the AIDS epidemic was that you realized that these were, the men in our community mostly who were dying. I mean, I will say I have had patients and friends who were queer women with HIV.
Yeah.
It's not like that doesn't happen. It's just not as likely. But it was realizing that it didn't matter, that as far as the government was concerned, if you were gay, you could die and you could suffer, and that was okay, and you deserved that. Right. And so that was kind of my sort of radicalization around this issue, was realizing, okay, it's not me, but it could be me.
Right.
And the government would act just the same if it was me and my women friends who had this illness and were dying, as the fact that it's my male friends is just kind of a quirk of epidemiology. But, that was sort of when I realized that this was something that I wanted to be involved in, was doing activism around this, was because I took it very personally. But also, it really did, we used the word genocide in ACT UP, and I think it's a perfectly reasonable use of that word.
Well,
what happened.
One of the things I remember,
the 80s.
I was going to say, one of the things I remember, just kind of lending to that, one of the recollections I have is that in order to sort of get the general public to care, because when you talk about the government, not caring, and it's like, well, that's an impact of society not caring, right? Because if society's putting enough pressure on the representatives, then the government will start to care.
Right.
So when the government doesn't care about something, it's because there's not enough social concern around it to motivate the government to make that adjustment. And so for what I recall was that in society, they did these things to sort of try to make people care. And one of the things they did was they would, and don't get me wrong, like I'm not saying everybody that's dealing with the illness, I have compassion for. So I'm not saying that we should be discompassionate toward a certain group for certain reasons, but they would trotted out the children, like the hemophiliac children.
Right.
And basically, though, the message became, they don't deserve this, right? These are people that got it, and they didn't do anything.
They were framed as innocent victims.
Yes. And I mean, they are innocent children, but that's different. Sorry, go ahead.
We had a slogan in ACT UP that was, all people with HIV are innocent.
Right.
Yes. Right. And so it was just so messed up to see. It's like, yes, I definitely care about these children. I think it's horrible what happened to them. I'm so sorry that our blood supply was that messed up and it wasn't screened and that they ended up with this illness and that many of them died. I mean, I have nothing but compassion for these children. But to use them in a way that says, this is why you should care because these people didn't go out and have sex. Again, it's that sexual stigma.
Exactly.
You had sex, so you deserve to die. I mean, literally, that's the message. And it is so messed up that not only did we have some conservatives in government, but we had a whole society making jokes about it and basically not caring.
I remember AIDS jokes.
Oh, it was horrible.
I remember that.
Yeah. I mean, I do too. And I remember being that young where I participated in that behavior, where I thought that was funny. And it's like, I'm glad I'm not that person anymore. But I look back on it and I'm like, how messed up was this? This was so messed up. And this is... there's that, and the other thing that we talked about once on a past show was the idea of how many people with celebrity power would not talk about it and ended up dying silently with all this. Anytime somebody got sick and they were not doing well and nobody would say what it was, everybody was like, that actor has AIDS, that singer has AIDS, and they would die.
Well, some of them didn't, some of them didn't. But
but I mean, what was happening though is it would come out later, and it was like, these are people who were gay. And some of them were like leading men in Hollywood. And so they could not be gay, right? They weren't allowed to be gay. You still didn't want to be a gay man in that society, whether you had HIV or not. It was like such a stigma around just homosexuality, and then this illness that's associated with it. And so all these people are dying silently. And it wasn't until like decades before we finally got, I think it was a basketball player who stood up and said, hey, I'm living with this.
Magic Johnson.
And that was okay, right? Because he was straight.
He came out.
Right, but it was
of course, a lot of people jumped to the conclusion that he was gay, but I don't think he is.
But I think a lot of the reason that he could come out and be that voice was because he wasn't gay, right? He wasn't perceived as gay,
right?
And I think that's what gave him a little bit more like cred that people would care. And it's like that. There's all this. It was almost like, if you're a celebrity and you're gay, we won't care.
Yeah.
If you're a celebrity and we perceive you as straight, then wait, we really like you. Right.
Well,
I will say he deserves a lot of credit.
Yes.
I was an HIV test counselor when he came out, and the number of people who came in and started getting tested after his announcement, it skyrocketed.
Because you start making it normal.
And I would ask people, what made you decide to come in and get tested? And people would say Magic Johnson. I mean, over and over and over again. It was huge. It was huge.
And I just think how many more people would be on top of their own sexual health if we had a society that supported it and not just one basketball player. Like, what if we had a whole society that was like, hey, this is okay. Go get checked. We don't want you to die. We care about you. And I mean, if we just had that kind of support, so many more people would be not sitting at home thinking, I don't want to know.
Exactly.
Well, and I'll also say that the whole AIDS epidemic thing, it had a definite racial component, definitely in the U.S., but also in the absolute neglect of what was happening in Africa.
That was hideous.
I mean, it's
still bad, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
it's still pretty bad.
Because they don't, even though, like you're saying, we have these drugs, but it's not like they're handing them out like candy in South Africa.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, they are, but they're dealing with an epidemic on a scale where trying to reach everybody is hard.
Well, I'm glad that they are getting the drugs.
That's
news to me.
Yeah.
So
there are a lot of American HIV providers who travel to Africa and help set up clinics there and help train the staff so that they can provide the care. And there are generic drugs which we don't have in the United States, but that are manufactured in other parts of the world that can be used less expensively. Don't have U.S. drug pricing.
Okay.
So they are able to do it. Now, one thing is that the level of blood work monitoring that we do here is not always possible in remote areas.
Right.
Like sometimes the way they tell the meds if the meds are working or not is they weigh you.
Yeah.
And if you're gaining weight, they know you're getting better. Like that's the level of monitoring sometimes because, doing viral loads every 3 months in, remote parts of the world is not always possible.
Yeah.
But they're able to provide adequate care and they're able to, sometimes people have to travel all day to come to the clinic and, it's all these things, there's all these different barriers. But it is getting better.
Okay.
But again, there are places where you can be executed for being gay and, there's still a long way to go.
So are you saying that you don't see as much then of a racist component like globally toward this, that, hey, we don't care because this country is poor or this country is black?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying, things are getting better, but it's, the sheer magnitude of the global epidemic is just, it's a massive effort and it needs massive money and resources, and it's getting some.
Okay.
And progress is being made, but yeah, absolutely, if this, there's a racist component, and there's a racist component in the United States too. Like I said, it is disproportionately African American and Latinx people who have a harder time accessing care for any number of reasons that have to do with money and stigma and trust of the medical system and all of those things. So absolutely there are, we used to always say if there was ever a cure, if there was ever effective treatment for HIV, it would become two epidemics, be the epidemic of the people who can afford treatment and can access it, and then the people who can't. And that's absolutely what we're seeing.
Yeah. Well, and with some elements in our culture who regard serious illness like this as some kind of moral condemnation, that doesn't help at all. But I can tell a personal story related to the early AIDS epidemic. When I was in Germany in the late 80s, our first round, I guess mid to late 80s, first round of HIV testing, which at the time was called HTLV-3. Okay, that was it's a long time ago. Yeah, so we had our first round of HIV testing, and everybody was apprehensive about that. And some of the apprehension was that people didn't want to know because if you were positive, people would think you were gay, and you'd get kicked out. So I was sitting there thinking, this is like a disease that could kill you, and you don't. You'd rather die without knowing because you don't want people thinking you're gay.
And the answer to that is yes.
Well, again,
yes. Right.
Yes.
That was absolutely
and
the
again,
answer.
There's also the step between knowing and taking action.
Right.
And sustaining that action. Again, there's drop-offs at every step in that process.
Right.
There's lots of people who know they're positive and are not in care.
Right. And so what happened was in this first round of testing for military personnel in Germany, which was a huge political issue over there because the Germans at that point were seriously having conversations about should we round up all the people who have this and keep them in sanitariums like they used to do with tuberculosis patients, and just not let them out.
To be fair, we had those conversations here.
Yes, we do.
It was sometimes messed up and scary, yeah.
But, this was, it's a big political issue as well. And so one of my pilots came up positive. And he had been having some, odd medical problems that seemed to be kind of escalating over time. And he'd been seeing some specialists up in the Frankfurt area, and he talked to me one day. We were out flying somewhere in Germany, and we happened to land at the same airfield for fuel. And he's like, yeah, I just talked to my doctor, and he's like, you should know I'm positive, and I got to decide what to do. And so, a couple of days later, the battalion commander actually called me in, and he said, yeah, this is not to leave this room, and we're not telling the company commander because we don't trust him to keep his mouth shut. But yes, Mr. G, your pilot, is actually being medevaced. And you need to know because we need a cover story. So we had to invent a cover story for this guy, for why he was leaving Germany 6 months before his normal rotation date. And so the cover story was that he was going to the Warrant Officer Advanced course at Fort Rucker, and there was a last-minute shortfall in the course, and so they pulled him because he was scheduled to go anyway. The reality was he was being medevaced to Walter Reed, and he already had like the whole AIDS-related complex and all that stuff going on.
Wow.
So.
And there were no effective treatments.
I was going to say, so he's probably not around anymore.
He died. Yeah. And he knew. I mean, when they did the full medical workup on him in Germany, and they told him, hey, this is what's going on. They told him, you have, like, at the rate you're progressing, about 6 months to a year. And that's it.
I mean, it was a death sentence.
Yeah. And, I was talking to him, and he's like, he said, I was over here earlier. He was a former enlisted guy, and then he went to flight school. And he said, I was over here earlier, and he said, spent a lot of time in the Frankfurt Underground. He said, that's probably where I got it, because he was gay. And he's like, I used to go have a lot of sex. And he said, that's probably where I got it, was, as a young man in the Frankfurt Underground. And
so I have a question then. So we're talking about, I guess, what's going on, and you're involved because you're a nurse practitioner, and we're sitting here and we're talking about this on World AIDS Day, and we're getting information out there, and we're trying to dispel some myths and maybe talk to people about why they should go forward and get treatment. We're doing what we can do here. Now, let's say that I'm at home and I'm listening to the podcast. And I'm like, wow, this is good information. This is, stuff I didn't know. Maybe I learned something today. I know I learned some things today. So what does that person do that can help? Like, you're talking about this idea of we need to get, more people into testing. We need to get more people to be able to afford the drugs, to be able to take the drugs that they actually need, that they want to take, but they can't afford. So what can someone do to help make those things happen when they're just, Jane or Joe citizen sitting at home listening to this information and feeling like they want to help?
Yeah, that's a huge question. I mean, as far as people's own personal health care, it is now considered absolutely a part of standard primary HIV care. Standard primary medical care. Yeah. For all adults to be tested at least once, and then at intervals based on the risk. And it's no longer the sort of thing where, like I said, I used to be a pre and post test counselor. You used to have to go to a training and get certified, and you would do a whole little spiel with people before and after they took their test. And there was a 2-week waiting period, where people had to sort of stress out about the results and all of that. And that's how we did testing in the 90s and for a while. But now it is considered to be something that your primary medical provider would do as part of your routine health screen, the same way they would test you for colon cancer when you turn 50, the same way they would give you a flu shot every year, the same way they would do mammograms. Like, it's just standard of care now that all adults should be tested. So it's not the sort of thing where you have to specially request it. Your doctor should, or your nurse practitioner should be offering it. And you should have to opt out of it rather than opting in. Okay. Now, of course, because of stigma, this doesn't always happen. So there are a lot of different ways that this is being addressed. Something that my clinic in Oakland just started doing is testing all patients in the emergency room for HIV and for hepatitis C. And they're picking up a lot of cases that way. Again, in prison, it's a standard thing when you walk in the door that you are tested unless you decline it. So, you know, we're trying to make it just a thing that everybody should do.
Yeah.
And to treat it as a special, different thing that you have to go and do on your own.
So what do citizens do, though, to help support this? Like, what can someone do?
Well, I would put at voting for politicians who support universal health care very high on that list.
Okay.
And advocating for that in your own way. You know, the whole pre-existing conditions thing, all of that stuff.
Okay.
You know, there's still a lot of issues with funding, as you said. We do have federal funds that pay for HIV medications for people that don't have other ways to pay for it. And that's federal through the Ryan White program, which is, you know, named for the 13-year-old boy with hemophilia who was, you know, sort of one of the first public faces of this epidemic. And the thing is that it's federal money, but it's administered by the states, and so there's a lot of disparity in how it's allocated. In California, nobody doesn't get HIV medicines because of money. I mean, I've had very small number of patients who had weird, you know, high co-pays with their insurance and stuff like that, and we had to find ways around that. But everybody who's positive will get medication in California.
Okay.
In other states, and I'm not going to name which particular states because I can't remember off the top of my head, but there are states where there are waiting lists where you literally have to wait for someone to die or move out of the state or whatever until you can qualify
That's
for Ryan White funds. So that needs to end. That needs to end. Everybody should just get it no matter what. Because the drugs are expensive, but we have ways to cover them.
And so what you're saying is, you know, support, you know, healthcare as much as you can. Universal healthcare is a good idea. You know, obviously people that are the representatives that are supporting those initiatives are going to be supportive of the other things that you're talking about. So in the short term, though, before we get universal healthcare, are there any sort of charities? Is there any groups that might be, you know, funding or helping with funding that that you would say you feel good about mentioning?
Right now, I am really big on telling the history of the early days of the epidemic, and that's something that I put a lot of time and energy into now is things like in San Francisco GLBT Historical Society and the AIDS Memorial Grove, and there's a Instagram, Facebook page called the AIDS Memorial page, where it's just photographs and stories of people who died and in some cases people who are still surviving. I really think telling those stories is important, and I very much live in fear of that history disappearing. You know, there's a whole generation of people who don't even understand that this was once considered a gay disease. You know, that all of that stuff, a lot of that is just invisible. So I think that's important, and I think it helps, you know, people to be compassionate and to want to help. I mean, I also think viewing it in the context of all the activism we see now with chronic illness and disability, I found that very valuable. And I think it's one thing that AIDS activism didn't do as well back in the days when I was really involved. I think, you know, supporting queer and trans youth and
what about public outreach? Are there groups that are doing any kind of public outreach that are trying to maybe work on getting people to be aware and to go get tested and to, you know, groups that are just doing publicity?
Well, I think Planned Parenthood offers
Planned Parenthood
testing.
Is a great example. Yes, they do, you know, HIV care. They do trans care. They, you know, they've made their clinics so much more inclusive and welcoming to, you know, queer and trans and non-binary people. I think that's all really important. You know, you look at what's happening with, trans kids in schools, stuff like that. Like that's, how the stigma lives on.
Right.
Right. Is by those sorts of things. I also am going to make a big pitch for PrEP.
Yes. Good. I wanted to talk about that. Yes.
Yes. It's always amazing to me how many people do not know that this exists. And it's so basic and it's so easy and it's so safe and effective. I mean, it's not for everybody, but it's a great option. And I'm all about there being more options.
Is that the one that's advertising now? Is there an ad for that? Because I think I've seen it.
Yeah, so just in case people aren't familiar, this is a pill that you take when you're HIV negative. And you're engaging in some higher risk activities, and it protects you from infection.
Or if you have a partner who's positive,
right,
you can also do that.
Yeah. And so basically, it's a little insurance pill that you can take that will help.
And what it is, to be very specific, is it's a combination pill with 2 antiretroviral medicines in it. They're the same meds that we use to treat people who have HIV, but it just stops transmission from taking place.
Okay. Right.
So that you have to have some blood work done, and you have to, be monitored every few months. And they also always offer very frequent testing for other STDs, because we're assuming that people who are taking PrEP are not always using condoms.
Right.
So that's something that I wish more people knew about. I wish more people talked about openly. There's still stigma about it,
There is one thing that I want to bring up that is like something that, I have my own personal feelings about it, but you're the person that works in this. So let me just ask you, what do you think about the rhetoric about the circumcision and HIV rates?
Oh, yeah.
Let's just make sure we get this in here before we close out the hour.
That's something that is being done as a measure to reduce transmission, not in the United States, but in other parts of the world where transmission is very high. And it does seem to reduce transmission. I'd rather people had the meds, but, if this is a thing that can be done in places where not everyone has the meds yet, I don't necessarily oppose it. It's funny because I don't actually think, that we should be circumcising babies in this country.
Right. I should make that clear. We're talking about adults, like sexually active adults here, and a choice.
Exactly. And if people want to do it, I think it should be an option. Again, I'm in favor of more options.
Yeah.
I always think more options is better. But that one's a little messy and complicated, and the science is kind of mixed, but it really does seem to lean in the direction of this.
How does it compare?
That can reduce transmission in places where treatment for everyone is not an option.
How does it compare, for example, to like condom use?
Probably not as good. Condom use or being undetectable is really what's the best.
Yeah.
But it does seem to reduce it.
Yeah, I spent quite a bit of time reading the 3 studies that were done in Africa initially that touted this as a benefit, and I found some problems with the methodology. So I'm unconvinced that it actually has the effect that people claim
I think
that
overall there was like some increase in what that is, like increase in protection, and what that was is not real clear.
Yeah.
But it's definitely not as good as like every other method you can use to avoid it.
Yeah.
And it also, one paper...
it's not something I don't think should be at the forefront of any, thing that we're doing. If communities want to try this as a stopgap measure, I'm not opposed to that.
Yeah.
But...
I heard I read one good paper that was like, well, it wasn't a paper, I guess. It was a letter written by a physician who had ethical concerns, basically saying that he felt that by promoting this, it almost seemed like what we were doing was saying, go out and have sex without a condom, because he's like, otherwise the circumcision won't help you. He's like, if you're using condoms, then it doesn't matter if you're circumcised or not, the protection rate is the same. He goes, this would only apply to people who are going to have sex without a condom when they know that they're in a population where there's a high risk of HIV, which he's just like, do we really want to put that message into people's heads?
Right.
And I mean, I understand what you're saying. You're like, hey, it's a tool, and I'm trying to fight this thing, and I will fight it with whatever tools I have, whether they're great tools or crappy tools. If they have any impact, I'm okay with trying it. And that makes sense to me. I mean, I understand where you're at, but it was an interesting thing when he was talking about this would only be effective if we were going to basically tell people don't use a condom.
Right.
Well, but my understanding is that this was being done in places where condoms weren't necessarily cheap or easy to come by.
Yeah.
Well, I have no idea.
And actually I guess one of the studies was in Uganda, and they had the ABC campaign, the abstinence, be faithful, and use condoms.
Yeah, I mean, of course, that's not an approach I agree with.
Right. I mean, only one of those is actually effective, and that's the C part, right? Use the condoms.
Right.
But, yeah, the thing is, when they had that campaign going, their HIV rates were falling because people were using condoms. And then a couple of things happened. This circumcision study came out and said, oh, well, all you have to do is get circumcised. And then, of course, there's the Catholic Church coming in and saying, oh, condoms are death, and actively discouraging condom use in vulnerable communities. And so, then the HIV rate starts to go up again. But I guess one of my problems with promoting circumcision as an HIV infection prevention method is that we've kind of already done that experiment here in the United States.
That was another one of the weird mixed studies, right? Was that why didn't this show effectiveness in gay male populations? Right.
Well, the epidemiology of HIV is really different in the United States than it is in other parts of the world. You know, it's much more heterosexual transmission in other parts of the world. It's different. Yeah. So that's why.
Right, but the circumcision studies you would think would be more pronounced in a population that's all men, and all men in a nation that generally circumcises.
Well,
but it wasn't.
But the thing is that the protection was really only for like in the African studies they studied purportedly heterosexual men only. Never mind the stigma attached to identifying as gay.
Right, as far as we know, right?
Right. Yeah. So it was supposedly all heterosexual men, and the protection was supposed to be for the circumcised man. So it wasn't for his partners or anything. If he actually contracted HIV and he was still having sex without a condom, it didn't offer any protection to his partners. So...
that makes sense. And of course, the point is, if men don't have it, they're not giving it to women. But,
but also, I mean, and that's the thing. It's like in other countries, there are countries where it is predominantly considered to be more of a heterosexual disease, and where women are actually the higher category.
Right.
Of people that have it.
That is definitely true.
Yeah.
No, so, and honestly, in the HIV world, we don't talk about this that much.
Right.
We're really trying to focus on getting treatment to everybody.
Sure.
That's where we really think the best, benefit is going to be. So yes, this is something that, there were some studies about this, and it's interesting and, maybe worth trying in certain very limited circumstances, but this is not a hill I'm going to die on.
Sure, no. And I'm not asking you to. I think having your perspective on it is interesting, and I certainly sympathize with somebody who is just like saying, whatever we can throw at this, let's throw at it, I'm not gonna sit here and crap on that position. So
well, and I support the right of any adult to make a decision about having their genitals modified in whatever way they want.
Sure, even whether it's protecting them from something or not.
Right, it doesn't matter.
Do it if you want, if that's what you're into. We are coming up on the hour.
Yeah. So
that went quick.
Yeah, it did. I guess the only other thing I was going to talk about is an article you posted on the Facebook page about a practice called stealthing. Are you familiar with that, Ingrid?
Oh, this could actually segue.
Yes.
No, I'm not sure what.
Okay. Stealthing is when a man secretly removes a condom during sex, even though
The partner.
The partner didn't agree to that.
I'm against that.
Oh, yeah. No, I think we're all against.
Yeah, we're all opposed to that. So, yeah, Tracy posted this article up there, and some people had some comments.
Yeah, the takeaways were kind of interesting from it. So it's like you're hearing about this, people that are sharing information and like trying to get together on how to best, get away with taking a condom off during sex. And there's like this group that's sort of, sharing their info on this. And it was interesting. The comments were kind of interesting. So I didn't even get the first one. Like, it didn't even make any sense to me, and people jumped all over it. But what was really interesting was that several people jumped on because their takeaway was, I don't understand why they would label this a movement, right? Because the headline called it a growing movement. Although it was, a gender-neutral article, right? Basically saying that this happens with, men and women, like it doesn't matter. And it was just really weird how the takeaway wasn't, holy cow, people are doing this and they're sharing information on how to do it better. It was, well, I take issue with labeling this a movement.
Yeah.
There's literally like about 3 people who posted that same comment. It was just like unbelievable. That's your takeaway, right? Is, I don't know if I call it a movement.
And I'm just like, this is sexual assault. Is what I would say.
Yeah, and that was the other thing. There were several comments that say, hey, this is assault. If you agree to sex with someone under certain conditions and then they unilaterally, change those conditions and they continue having sex with you, then that's assault. You don't get to change.
That's what I would say.
Because then your consent's no longer valid. And then, of course, there were a bunch of commenters.
I just had to reply because somebody actually just, in your response, they took issue with the fact that you used a swear.
Oh, yeah.
And I just posted back and said, so tone trolling.
Yeah.
Words are not magic.
Yeah.
Yes. So.
Indeed.
Yeah, I used the word fucking because I was sick of people focusing on the word movement as applied to this and not addressing the actual assault. So I said, hey, you can call this whatever you want, as long as then we can have a substantive discussion about the fucking assault.
Yeah. And their response is basically, oh, you used a swear.
Yeah.
Like, okay, we're not going to have a substantive discussion then.
Yeah.
Basically, that's your answer. The first thing, you're freaking out because it's called a movement. Now you're freaking out that she used a swear in an answer that actually had information. You ignore it's like you ignore the information in the article, take issue with a label. You ignore the information in the response, take issue with a swear word. It's like, I think substantive discussion isn't something this person is actually capable of having.
They're not interested in that.
Yeah.
And then,
and that was, something we ran into a lot in ACT UP, right, is that our protests were very confrontational and they were not nice. And we sometimes shouted people down and didn't let them speak. Like, we deplatformed people and we, would talk very graphically about sex and about, what this epidemic was doing to people. And people said, oh, you're going to alienate people. And I would support you if you would just be more nice. And, that is definitely, these are things that you have to talk about in real language, and people get to express their anger and their grief and their rage. And that's how,
and
I do think ACT UP can take some credit for the conversation that we have
absolutely.
About
because,
this epidemic now that we did change the landscape a little bit,
Yeah, these things, these are not pretty, these conversations. And if we sanitize them, people don't get what the issue is. And I think that was something that, we spent most of the 80s with a president who refused to even acknowledge that this was happening. And, to devastating effect with gay men in particular who were bearing the brunt of the epidemic in this country.
Yes.
And so, yes, I think ACT UP deserves tremendous credit for making people uncomfortable with ignoring it.
Yes, that's a very good way of saying what we were trying to do.
Yes. Yes. Well, Did we have anything else we wanted to bring up today?
I don't. I thought it was fantastic.
Yes.
And I just want to say thank you, Ingrid, for agreeing to be on. I just want to let people know you had some very short notice, agreed to fill in for another guest who wasn't able to make it. And so this was, phenomenal that you could be on and talk about some of your experience and your knowledge.
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for your questions and for bringing up this topic on World AIDS Day and the day of the death of one of the presidents who stood by while this epidemic raged on and did nothing.
Yes, I agree. Yes, fitting.
Right.
So, yes, I'm going to sign off with you now, Ingrid, and I think we're going to wrap this episode up.
All right.
So thanks for everybody for joining us today. Go out and learn something about World AIDS Day if you don't know already. And with that, I'll just say we don't need a savior. We have each other. It's all we've ever had and all we'll ever need. Thank you.